I was recently asked about different swivel knife blades, swivel knives, and their use. Now, there's probably a textbook version of this, and then there's my version of it. This was my very first swivel knife blade. You can see that it is at a slight angle. It is a fairly thick blade compared to what I'll show you later is a Filigree blade. So thickness wise it is fairly thick. It is cut at an angle, and you can see the angle that I've got there to this has been polished out of proportion slightly. Now since 1978 I have only reshaped this blade twice, and every time it goes slightly in a different shape over years with the polishing, with stropping it. So I'll show you just briefly. This one just used totally upright, and you can do a fairly small angle with it because of the angle of the blade. So that's how I use it. Kind of one of my standbys. I do use its ceramic equivalent as well. It looks exactly the same width. It is also cut at a slight angle, as you can see. There, so those two are basically the same swivel knife blades. There. So that is a standby, a good standby. It's what I, if I can put that in quotes, grew up with. So that's what I know really well, and I use them often. Probably the next one I have will be this one. It is a straight cut at the bottom. It is straight. There you can see there's no angle to that blade. It is kind of the same thickness, the same width as the one that I use, but it has no angle to the blade. So this one I mostly use for straight lines, cutting just straight lines. Because of the shape of the blade, it does not make sharp corners very easily, but straight lines, no problem. Okay, so that's what I use this guy for mostly. Just as an aside, I do have another video about stropping swivel knives, and I'm not going to talk about that now. They do have to be stropped often, and they do have to stay sharp. Okay, so then the next one, so the difference between those two, the angled one and then the straight one, those two there, is basically that the straight one, straighter lines, long curves. The angled one is easier to use on short curves. Okay, let's put those two aside. Then I have here the difference between an angled one and another angled one. Both are angled. The only difference between those two is their actual width. So if you look at them on that way, one is quite thinner, this one. That one is fairly thick. So the thick one, regular swivel knife. The thin one is considered Filigree blade. So much finer detail can be done with that, and it can cut quite a bit deeper into the leather. And that's the main difference between those two. I do have a guy that I often use there as well, and that is a Filigree ceramic blade. Okay, so there's the two ceramics I use, one a thicker blade and one a thinner blade. And the thinner one I use not necessarily for filigree work, but for cutting very fine detail. and thinner leather that I don't cut all that deep. Okay, then next one is a straight edge again, like that, but you'll see that its blade is what we call a hollow ground. In other words, the actual surface of the blade has been ground to be hollow on both sides, and that means that there's less surface to polish on this blade as opposed to the other straight one. So those are both straight, but you'll see that the surface that you have to polish on the two vary quite a lot. So obviously the hollow ground one is going to polish faster. It does kind of make for a bit of a thinner blade, looking at it this way as well. So there is a slight difference in that also. Now just and there's a narrower blade than the wide one, also a hollow ground blade, but also straight cut. There's no angle to the blade, so used for regular work. And with these guys, it's much of a what you get used to and what you learn to use best. Your technique is not dependent on the actual blade. It is based on how well you can use them. Okay, then the few uses, if I attack it from that angle, obviously I said that a thicker blade, straight cut, will be used for long straight lines. Perfect, no problem. If I have lots of detail, curvy, I go for, first of all, an angled blade, cut at an angle, and then also maybe a thinner blade like that. Okay, then there's a few other purposes for the swivel knife blade, and one of them is if you have a really thin piece of leather. So this is probably about 3 to 3 ounce, I would say. So it's very thin leather, and I have a circle marked on there. Maybe I could increase the light at this point. Let's see. I hope that will help. I have a much circle marked out on there. I want to cut that circle out. Now I can just simply take a blade, any straight blade that I have, and cut out that leather. This is just a craft knife, perfect to use. Okay, but I might want to have that edge, the actual edge, nicely beveled at the same time. Now putting one of these monsters, an edge beveler, onto that piece of leather is going to be a bit difficult. The reason for that is there's not much space on the edge of a piece of leather this thin to use an edge beveler properly. You can put it on top of another piece of leather and do it that way, or if your project allows for it, another trick that I like is to cut out that shape first with a swivel knife. So let me get that wet, and then what I do is I pick a thick swivel knife. So this one, fairly thick, and the idea is that I want to shape the piece of leather that I'm cutting out to have a nice edge, almost imitating a beveled edge. So okay, now I'm going to take this knife and I cut that, pre-cut almost, if you want to call it that. I pre-cut my shape out of the leather, and I go as deep as I possibly can, as deep as the leather would allow me, with this blade. Now please don't look at the straightness of my line here. I'm not focusing on that, I'm focusing on the blade. Obviously perfectionist might have a heart attack, so this is a warning. So there we go. I have cut that outline with that blade. So now if I could illustrate this to you, I have had my surface of the leather was there, and what I did was I made a beveled edge there, almost, with that swivel knife cut. So now all I need to do is to cut that little piece of leather through there, and look at what I remain with. The edge of my project of the thin leather has got a nice round cut. So from that point, any knife will do, depending on how thin, how much detail I want to get. I might very well use a scalpel blade for that, something like that. Put it right in the groove there and just cut along the groove. You might want to have it dry first so that it's more stable and dry, but there we go. So that's one use I have for a swivel knife in cutting leather. And of course you have to adapt this to the type of project you have. If your project demands something different, then sure, go for it. But this is one of the shortcuts available. And I'm not going to really be able to show you the difference between this and just a straight knife cut through, because it's so very small. But there I've got my piece cut out. If I just cut through a piece of leather, then I'm sitting with a very square cut edge, whereas this edge of this is now almost like I beveled around the edges, and that has been achieved. Right, something short and sweet to end with, and that is a swivel knife fallacy. And one of the swivel knife fallacies I found over time is about the yoke, this part of the swivel knife. Now I have been at leathercraft shows where the swivel knife makers would you say, show me your swivel knife, and the first thing they do is they pick up the swivel knife and spin the yoke around, and wow, impressive, 20,000 revolutions per second and all that. And immediately that turns me quite off, because that has nothing to do with how well the swivel knife works at all. That might have ball bearings in it, and so what? Maybe if you're 94 years old and very arthritic, you will need that smooth acting yoke. But for normal work, even the old standby, like this one, I think comes from the 1980s or 90s, doesn't swivel like that. But when I put my finger in it and I turn with my other fingers, that yoke turns, and that's all I need. The important part of the swivel knife is the blade, and if the blade is not strong and sharp and stropped, then forget it. That's got to be really well stropped, and it's got to be sharp. Then your swivel knife will work better, regardless of what happens on the other side. So there you go. have fun with swivel knives. I hope that answers some questions. If you have more, leave a comment, and I can come back to you and maybe answer a few more questions. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.